Recording. Thank you.
Hey, beauty friends, it's Meredith from Beadalon. Welcome to the Michael's class. Let's see, I just need to fix my screen real quick and I will reintroduce myself. I'm Meredith Roddy from Beadalon and Artistic Wire. Welcome to class today. We have a big group and we have a lot of information to cover. So this class for the Michael's Community Classroom is called Get Wired. And you'll be happy to know that I had my afternoon coffee. I usually have it after class, and I had it before class. So I too am fairly wired for our class today. So what we are going to be doing for class today is going to be a little bit different than how we usually run. We usually do a project. But today what we're going to be doing is talking all about wire and wire working. Now at Michael's, they carry a range of Beadalon German style and Beadalon artistic wire from 12 to 26 gauge. So that's where I'm going to be focusing our class today. Now, Yvette is in the comments. So if you have any questions, if you have a specific question, please feel free to type that into the comments. I will see as they scroll by. And if there's something that she thinks that I really should be touching on, she'll go ahead and interrupts me and ask the question so I can address it. This, of course, is for our beauty friends who are joining us live. If you are watching us on the replay, feel free to contact us through the Michael's Community Classroom or through Beadalon and let us know if you have any follow-up questions. So as I mentioned, we are talking about 12 gauge through 26 gauge wire today. And in the next hour or so, I hopefully will at least scratch the surface of the amazing amount of information that's out there about wire wrapping. I'm going to try to keep it as basic, as intermediate, and a little bit as advanced as I possibly can. And again, please feel free to interact and be a part of the discussion in the comments. And oftentimes what I love is in the comments, some people ask and then somebody else will come on in and answer the question, which is really what I think is so valuable about these live classes. This class, as Kelly mentioned, will be available to watch on the Michael's community, or I'm sorry, on the Michael's YouTube channel as part of the community classroom. And that usually goes up in about 24 to 48 hours. So you can go back and watch over and over again. If there are any bloopers, you can giggle. You can giggle live now, you can giggle live later on. But for the information, it's going to be a lot. And you'll probably want to go back and listen a couple of times. So without any further ado, I think, Kelly, we are ready to go ahead and take that overhead camera. And I'm going to start at the very, very beginning. So today's class is about wrapping wire, okay? So it is not about bead stringing wire, which is you're used to seeing me talk about a lot in the classes. We do stringing projects. We use Beadalon stringing wire. This is for when you want to make something out, you want to string beads and have it be nice and flexible and really malleable and a piece of jewelry, right? You put a clasp on it, you use crimping techniques, and there's a great video if you haven't watched it yet, although I'm sure most of my beauty friends in here have, called 5 Things You Should Never Do While Making Jewelry, talking all about bead stringing wire. It's kind of, it is the complement to this class. So this is all about wrapping wire. That class is all about stringing wire. So as I mentioned, and let me just grab a 20 gauge wire, which is probably what we're most familiar with seeing. This is going to be wire that we shape, that we bend, that we use our tools with to make different pieces of jewelry. And generally, when people start with wire wrapping, they start in one of two places, either making simple loops or wrapped loops like these loops here. And so just if you are having any kind of confusion about what we're talking about today, strung piece goes on bead stringing wire. And today we're talking all about wire working. So what we're going to do is we are going to start at 12 gauge wire, and we are going to go all the way up to 26 gauge wire. I'm going to talk about each gauge. I'm going to talk about some of my favorite things that I like to do with each of these gauges. And right off the bat, I want to make a really firm and serious statement, which is these are guidelines. And in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about a lot of substitutions. I think that oftentimes in jewelry making, especially when we're getting started, we make the assumption that we have to use exactly the same material that the instructor is recommending, or exactly the same bead color, or the same whatever it is. And what I firmly believe as a jewelry instructor is if you can make it work for you and you like the way that it looks when you're making it, try it. There's no, these are we're not working in sterling silver and 14 karat gold. We're working in copper. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just one second. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so the first thing that we have to talk about before we get into anything else is the difference between artistic wire and German style wire. And again, tons of information coming at you. And I'm trying to make it organized, but you'll see that as I'm going along, there's so much to talk about that sometimes it's hard to keep it linear. So I will be jumping back and forth. I know I did say I was going to start talking about 12 gauge and this is 20 gauge, but I think this is the best illustration for talking about the two different types of wire that you're going to see when you walk into your Michaels store. So artistic wire and German style wire. These are both 20 gauge wires. They are both round wires, but you can see the packaging is very different. This one comes in a pack. Let's try not to hit my camera while we're talking about that. And this one comes on a little spool. So that's the first difference, right? The second difference is something called hardness. And again, we're going from beginner to intermediate and a little bit of advanced in this class. And when I say hardness, the best way to talk about that is on the back of the German style package and in the handout that Yvette so gloriously provided for us today. You can see the wire hardness scale. And these are some vocabulary words that we need to learn when we are talking about wire work. So our first vocabulary word is full hard, 3/4 hard, half hard, which I'm going to be talking about a lot today, quarter hard, and then dead soft, which I'm also going to be talking about a lot today. And you can read here, there are a lot of different types of wire in here that fall into these different categories. But for our purposes, one of the wires that we are going to be talking about today is actually this 316L stainless steel, because a 20 gauge of this is available in Michaels. We are also going to be talking about non-tarnished brass. We are also going to be talking about German style wire, which fits kind of in this half hard to quarter hard area. And then we are going to be talking about dead soft wire. So is everybody super confused yet? I hope not. These are the words that I'm going to be using to describe everything. And the most important takeaway for this is German style wire is going to be half hard, and artistic wire is going to be dead soft. Now, why does that matter? Why that matters is several different things. First and foremost, what I think is the most important is how it feels working with it on your hands. One of the things that people don't talk about a lot is how these repetitive wire working movements and motions can be really hard on your hands. So you want to make sure that when you are doing wire work, you take a lot of breaks, you stretch your hands out. I find myself doing a lot of this, and you be careful, because you can see I have a little Band-Aid here on my finger today, because as I was preparing for class, I grabbed one of my tools and, completely not paying attention, took a little chunk out of my finger. So that was my taking one for the team, so that you know that even someone who is doing this for a class can still injure themselves while wire working. So the second thing is how hard you need your wire to be for your wire work. So just kind of file that in the back of your head, and it will become important, and I will be speaking to that as we go along. But keep in mind, German style wire is going to be a half hard wire, and artistic wire is going to be a dead soft wire. And for our scientists in the group, really what that means is how tightly the molecules within the wire are compressed. So the dead soft wire, the molecules are kind of dancing around with a little bit more space in between them. And the German style wire, the molecules are a little bit closer together. They're not moving quite as much. Maybe they're doing a slow dance. And then the stainless steel wire, which difficultly looks very similar to the German style wire, but you do have to look out. It says right up here, 316L stainless steel. And remember, I mentioned that that stainless steel wire is up here at the full hard level. Those molecules are coming together really, really tight. They're not moving, they're not jiving, they're not even slow dancing. They're standing at attention almost. So those are the three different tempers of wire. So that's a new vocabulary word too, a new temper of wire. Okay, I went over those three things. We did the scale. We talked about half hard and dead soft. The last thing that I want to mention is the three different shapes of wire. And those are round, half round, and square. Now, in Michaels, there are all three shapes. The round wire is, of course, the wire that you are going to be most familiar with. The square and half round wire was on my work surface right here to show the difference, but I am not seeing that right now. So when I find them as I'm going through all of my bags, I will show those as well. So let's get started with the 12 gauge. So what I use 12 gauge for is to make things that I need to be as stiff and as thick as possible. So one of the things that I really like making with the 12 gauge wire is these adjustable bangle bracelets. And you can see how thick and how firm this is. That's the kind of thing that you need for that structure. You could not certainly do this with 26 gauge wire, because it would just fall apart. It would kink all over the place. So a 12 gauge wire is going to be your thickest and your strongest of the gauges. And that's a tough thing to kind of get your head and hands around sometimes, is what do the numbers mean? So I'm here to tell you, and I'm starting with the thickest. So hopefully when a pattern calls for a specific gauge of wire, you'll remember that it starts with the thickest. And 12 gauge is by no means the thickest of all possible wires that you can find, but it is the thickest wire that is available in Michaels. Now on the handout that you received or clicked on the link, we talk about something called a Sumac Weave. And of course, my Sumac Weave is now tangled up, but I wanted to show what is meant by that. So you can see these great big thick wires are what are providing structure to this piece, with the 26 gauge wire woven all around on the inside. So one of the things that you'll see a lot is different gauges of wire being used together. And this is one of those cases. Now, I used 12 gauge wire in my example, but as I mentioned in the beginning, 14 gauge wire, 16 gauge wire, 18 gauge wire, even sometimes you can go as thin as 20 gauge wire can also be used for this technique. So again, in the small amount of time that we have today, I'm going to try my best to give as many tips, tricks, clues, and information as I possibly can about working with all of these different wires. But again, there's so much information and so many different philosophies and different thoughts on how to on what wire you want to use for what. So we just showed, I'm gonna do it like this. We just showed 12 gauge wire. And so now I want to show 14 gauge wire. And I often will use 14 gauge wire for many of the same things that I use 12 gauge wire for. You can see it is a little bit thinner than the 12 gauge wire. I have both the silver and the gold here together. It's a little bit thinner. It's a little bit more easily bendable, but not a lot, right? Because you can still see it's still pretty stiff. Okay. What I like using this for is stems for my French beaded flowers. So when you make the flowers, and this was a class that you can find on the Michael's Community Classroom YouTube channel, I like using this wire specifically for my stems. I find that it's just the perfect combination of really strong, but also soft enough that I can bend it the way that I want it to. So 14 gauge wire kind of has a little special place in my heart, because that the flowers are really kind of where I started rekindling my jewelry making journey. So 16 gauge wire is one of the more popular gauges of wire for wire work for a couple of different reasons. Where the 12 and the 14 gauge wire can be very hard on your hands, especially as we get older, especially as we are making things in repetitive kind of over and over situations. I find that 16 gauge wire is that perfect sweet spot between being strong enough to make a bangle bracelet, but still malleable enough that it's not hurting my hands and it's not hard to work with. So 16 gauge is oftentimes my go-to for making bangles like this. And this again was a class that we did, gosh, way back when, in the Michael's Community Classroom. I also really like using 16 gauge wire for these hook clasps. So you can see there's a wrapped loop here that I've made my eye, and a hook made out of the 16 gauge. Now I can tell I made this out of artistic wire because it's a little softer than I would like. This one I think was made out of German style wire. And I can just tell that from having done this a gazillion times and knowing kind of how it feels in my hands. I would recommend, again, if you want a firmer and stiffer bracelet design, 16 gauge German style wire is a great place to start. Oftentimes people just want to know, like, where do I start? How do I get started with all of this? There's so many different numbers, so many different gauges. I'm so confused. I'm so overwhelmed. So I'm here to tell you that 16 gauge is a great place to start when you want to make bangle bracelets like this. So this guy I whipped up this morning just to have a little bit of a discussion on work hardening. So that's another word that's very important when you're talking about wire work, is work hardening. And what that does is it compresses the molecules. So if we have dead soft wire and our molecules are dancing around, if we hammer them, or we twist them, or we work them back and forth in different ways, those molecules stop dancing so quickly and start slow dancing. And they even could start doing that lining up at attention like a full heart. So this is a 16 gauge piece of wire that I coiled around using the coiling gizmo this morning. And if I were going to make this into a piece of jewelry, I would throw all kinds of dangles and embellishments and all kinds of fine stuff on this. But it's a really great way of using that 16 gauge wire to make a very, very firm and very hard piece of jewelry. Now, this is where I hurt my finger because I was not paying attention. And the wire was hardened so much in that twisting process that you can see I'm giving it the go ahead for trying to get it even more into a round shape, and it's resisting me. That 16 gauge wire is when you start work hardening it, can become almost even harder or firmer than the 12 or the 14 gauge wire. And this is a great class, and it is something that I have on the docket for the future, is showing how to do this as a base, and then we're just gonna bling it out and embellish the stuff out of it and make for some really fun really fun designs. It's a great base, much like this is. It gives you so many different options for embellishment and for design. Okay, so we've gone through 12, 14, and 16 gauge wire. And for me, I kind of lump those three gauges together. I think it's good to think about the gauges of wire in terms of the toughest gauges, the middle gauges, and the thinnest gauges, because in those three categories, many of the gauges and men can be substituted and used interchangeably. So now we're moving into the 18, 20, 22 kind of a category. And here you can see that in the store, you'll see either 18 gauge artistic wire or 18 gauge German style wire. Once we get into the 18, 20, and 22 gauge categories, I'm trying to think if there's a good delineation for when you would use one over when you would use the other. And I will be very honest, oftentimes it comes down to what do I have on hand, with a couple of different exceptions. The first one that I want to talk about that I like to use this 18 gauge wire for is making these really pretty bar necklaces. I'm actually wearing one today, coincidentally. But all this is one piece of wire. So I made a wrapped loop here. I strung my beads on. I made a wrapped loop on the other side, and I attached the chain before I wrapped the loops, of course, but you could also do that with a jump ring, but that's another class for another day. But I really like using 18 gauge wire for this because, again, it's that perfect sweet spot for me that A, it will go through my beads, B, it is stiff enough that this is going to hold its shape. But it is malleable enough that I can make those really nice, perfect wrapped loops without too much trouble. So that is one use for that 18 gauge wire. Another use for the 18 gauge wire is these wrapped briolets. So is that my most perfect wire wrapping I've ever done? No, but I did want to show that for any kind of top drilled bead, using the 18 gauge wire is a great way to attach that as a dangle do for for a bracelet, for a necklace, for anything that you want to dangle something from. This too was an old class from the Michaels Community Classrooms. Everybody sensing a theme here? I am bringing out some of the older things that I have made as part of my classes to show where this all fits together and where this all fits in as a on a continuum. So that's a good amount on 18 gauge wire, because I want to be able to spend a good long time on 20 gauge. So 20 gauge is the most popular of the wires that Beadalon certainly sells the most of. I know that I would imagine that it's the most popular gauge that Michaels sells the most of. It is a fabulous beginner's gauge. If you were only to buy 1 gauge of wire, I would recommend 20 gauge. It is the perfect gauge for this bracelet that I showed in the beginning. This is 18 gauge. I think I mentioned that before, but you could certainly do this with 20 gauge wire, and it would be just as beautiful. The wire would be a little bit thinner. And in fact, I actually have that right here. Bear with me for 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so I have some links made with 20 gauge so you can see the difference in the gauges. Let me see if I can make that scene. It's tough to see on the camera. And it's ridiculous that I've been doing this long enough now that I can just look at that and know which gauge is which. Sometimes I don't always get it right, but most of the time I do. But you can see those wrapped loops and good beginner tip. I always, and I don't say always a lot, but I think mostly always, when I am starting a new technique of wire, I will go with a thinner gauge than is called for when I am first learning a technique. Wire can be very unforgiving and it can be difficult. And so when I'm learning something new, I want to get the technique down before I move on to making it hard. So a good tip that I always like to pass along is using that softer or that thinner wire for starting a project. So I just wanted to show in the 20 gauge family, because it is the most popular, the different varieties. And I think that it's helpful, especially when you are, when you're not quite sure what all of this stuff means. That of course we have the 3 different colors here. There's also an antique brass color that doesn't get a lot of play. And I wanted to bring that in because I had that in my group. But then of course the artistic wire is going to be on these smaller spools. And there's no pop quiz, but if there were, I would ask what is the difference between artistic wire and German style wire? And of course the artistic wire is that dead soft wire. And just to come back and reiterate this in the 20 gauge, this 316L stainless steel, because I don't want anybody to go into Michaels to think that this is just regular old silver color or silver plated, I should say, German style wire, and get it home and try to do wire wraps with it and realize, oh my gosh, that's a doozy. Meredith said it would be softer. Why is this so hard to use? This is because this is a full hard, almost full hard wrapping wire. Now, why would you use stainless steel wire? This is great for if you are doing components, rings, something that you want to be very, very stiff, but very thin. Because in order to get the stiffness of this 20 gauge stainless steel wire, you would have to probably go down to a 12 gauge in the German style or in the artistic wire. It is ideal for wire wrapping, but for very specific items. And like I mentioned, components, and rings where you want it to be very thin, or as thin as 20 gauges, but also very strong. And just remember, small incremental movements are your friends for stainless steel wrapping wire. And in the last 10, 15, 20 minutes of class, I'm going to play around and show some things that I will make with the different gauges. So if you would like to, for those students who are joining me live, our live BD friends, write in the comments if there's a specific gauge, a specific technique that you want me to do a demo of. I have a list in my head, but I would love to know what people are most interested in seeing. And please don't everybody say 12 gauge wire. I'll do some finger stretches. Okay, so 20 gauge wire. So some other things that this 20 gauge wire is good for are making ear wires, making jump rings, making coils, all different kinds of kind of the basic components of wire wrapping. So that's one of the reasons why I mentioned 20 gauge wire is generally the most popular, because it makes the most amount of things of putting together jewelry. Similarly, and again, remember I said kind of 12, 14, and 16 gauge go together in my book. So too do 18, 20, and 24. So moving on to 22 gauge wire, and you can see I had everything separated into these bags, and that is a really good way of storing your wire after the fact, because the artistic wire comes on these little spools here, which is fantastic, but there is nothing to tell you that this 22 gauge wire is 22 gauge after you take it out of the package. When you've been working for Beadalon and artistic wire for 14 years, like I have, you can kind of know it just by looking at it or by holding it up to another one that you know the gauge of. But do yourself a favor, invest in some little baggies or some containers, like a Tupperware container, anything that works for you, and just put what it is. I will also write on my containers whether or not it's half hard, if it's square, if it's German style, what have you. But 22 gauge is actually the size wire that I like to use for making ear wires. And when I make ear wires, I generally will make them using 22 gauge wire. The other thing that I love using 22 gauge wire for are these little knotted head pins. That's a technique that if you take my classes a lot, you will see me making those knotted head pins. It's one of my absolute favorite things to make. That is a 22 gauge wire. That's the best thing for 22 gauge wire. I also use 22 gauge wire generally for my wrapped loops, because one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet is the size of the holes of your beads. So backing up just a couple of steps. One of the things that we recommend at Beadalon for all things, not only wire work, but mostly for bead stringing, is you want to fill the holes of your beads as much as possible with your stringing material. So that has there are a lot of different reasons why. The most important is to stop for the abrasion. But when you have a bead with a large hole and a small wire, that bead is going to wiggle around possibly more than how you want it to behave on your piece. So many of the beads at Michael's have larger holes. These beads actually have smaller holes, which is why I use this 22 gauge wire to wire wrap within them. But again, so many different if-then things to think about when you're doing your wire wrapping. And this is one of those important important things to mention is the size of the holes. So of course I wouldn't have been able to do this wire wrap probably with 18 gauge wire because the holes were too small. And because I do a lot of my wire wrapping with small beads and with small holes, I like to use 22 gauge and sometimes 24 and 26 gauge to do my wrapped loops. Oh my goodness, so much information. Okay, so that is 22 gauge wire. Again, making ear wires, wrap loops, simple loops, that wrapped head pin, coiled beads. So where this original example that I showed way back in the beginning, these coils look fantastic when done with 22 gauge wire. And as you're making these coils, they work harden. In the very beginning, we talked about work hardening. The more you move the metal around, the more you move this wire, the more those molecules are compressing. Well, starting with a 22 gauge wire is going to be much easier on your hands, on your wrists, and on your joints than starting with a thicker wire. And quite frankly, I like the way that this looks as well. A very good comment came through, and I'm glad that I was reminded, because what I mentioned it earlier and did not come back around to it until right now. When you are making ear wires and components for strength, when you're using 22 gauge, German style wire is going to be the way to go. Artistic wire, even if you work harden it with a hammer and a bench block, is not going to harden up quite enough for a nice strong ear wire. But that being said, for wrapped loops, no problem at all using the artistic wire. But if I were doing a simple loop, again, German style wire. It's always about a trade-off when we're really with anything, but especially in wire work, you're trading off strength for ease of use. Okay, so that is 22 gauge wire. Let's move along to 24 gauge wire. So again, at Michael's, 24 gauge wire is available in the both the German style and the artistic wire. And I like using 24 gauge wire for making wire crochet. So this is a class that I did a couple of weeks ago now, using a crochet hook, and it's actually really just a chain stitch, but you can see how kind of delicate and airy and fun this piece ends up looking using that 24 gauge wire. You can also do this with 26 gauge wire. Again, the gauges sometimes can be interchanged, but again, the harder the wire, the harder it is going to be to use. So artistic wire for wire crochet is definitely what I would recommend. But if you have super strong wrists and only German style wire on hand, try it. It might be the perfect thing for you. So that was 24. And then lastly, my 26 gauge wire, I had it with my example of the soutache. And of course I put it aside so I would be able to show it again, and I don't see it. So bear with me for 1 second, friends. Once I get going with all of this stuff, I get so excited. And then it's like with my scissors, whenever I cut something and I put it down, I immediately lose my scissors, even though they are right next to me. So I think that piece might be gone for good. But what I did want to show, and I'm sure that what I'm looking for will pop up for me when I least expect it, is making an ear wire and making a wrapped loop and making a knotted head pin. So to do some of those things, I am going to use 20 gauge wire. And I want to talk a little bit about some tools. Okay. So first 3/4 of the class, we talked all about different types of wire. But one of the things that is the most important thing to go along with all of this wire talk is what tools to use with that wire. So just for a couple of very simple demonstrations, very simple projects, I want to talk about some of the tools that I cannot live without when I'm working with wire. And the first one is this one here. It's called the Nylon Jaw Pliers. And this is the flat Nylon Jaw Pliers. Also in Michael's, you'll find a round Nylon Jaw Pliers. And you can see what I'm doing here. I'm pulling the wire through the jaws of the Nylon Jaw Pliers. And what that's doing is it is straightening that wire. It's taking any of the kinks out that had been in there. And it is work hardening it, right? So we're compressing the molecules. So as we are doing whatever it is that we need to be doing, we need straight wire, and we need to think about how soft or hard that wire is. And just as a little aside, the way to soften wire is with fire, but you cannot do that with the German style or the artistic wire, because while it is a copper core, it has a coating on it, and then it has a tarnish resistant nylon coating on top of that. So if you take a flame to this, it's not going to be pretty. It is going to be no bueno. All right, so let's put the glasses on, and I'm going to show just a couple of different techniques, and I'm going to show doing these things. I'm going to show it with 20 gauge wire. I'm going to show it with 16 gauge wire. This might be 14 gauge wire, thick wire. And then we're going to go up to and try it with a 24 gauge wire, just to be able to see, again, the differences between these different wires. So I'm going to do a simple loop. Okay, this is where kind of the first thing that you learn when you do wire work. So the way I make my simple loop is I use my chain nose pliers, and I bend my wire down at a 90-degree angle. A couple of different ways people do this, but this is how I do it. And you can see this big black mark on my round nose pliers. That's how I know that I put my wire at that black mark every time. My loops are always going to be the right, or the same size, I should say. So I just rotate my wrist around to make my loops and try to both look at what I'm doing in the camera and not in the camera. But that is the simple loop, right? So that was with 20 gauge artistic wire. Now we're going to do this with, I think this is either 14 or 16 gauge, much, much thicker wire. Okay. And you can see, I'm going to bend that over 90 degrees, just close to 90 degrees as I can get. Okay. And I'm going to come over here again. And I just know from having done this a gazillion times that I need to go further up in the jaw of my my round nose pliers to make that loop the way it should be. And I just need to give it a little bit of a zhuzh. So you can see, same technique, two very different sizes of loops. Okay, so now let's just go ahead for fun and pull out from the 24 gauge, the 24 gauge spool. And I always like showing this because whenever I do, I always get the comment, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that you could do that. So let me show that what to do here. So I used the perforation, I opened this up, I took the spool out. I'm just gonna uncatch the wire from the spool. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that wire back in and poke it through that little hole. So now I have a little dispenser for my wire. It stays in the package. If the package was too big, you could even snip this hang tab off, but it keeps it nice and contained. As I was going through all of my wires to get ready for class this morning, I have some good bird's nests of wire in my studio for sure. So it's always a good idea to keep your wire nice and tamed. And I wish that we also had this wire for our German style wire, but unfortunately it is not the case. All right, so now I'm going to do that simple loop with a 24 gauge wire, and you can see how thin this is and how easy it is to bend, but also how easy this would be to pull out of, right? So if I'm trying to pull out of the 16 gauge, nothing's coming out of that 16 gauge. If I try to pull out of the 20 gauge, it's still pretty firm there. But you saw when I put my my jaw right into that 24 gauge loop, right out. So you're not going to want to do a want to do a regular loop with that. So let's do that same demonstration with a wrapped loop. And I am using wire cutters for cutting this. A tip that I always like to recommend when you're using your thickest wire, memory wire shears are actually a great way to cut that wire. You would think, since the name says memory wire shears, that you would only cut them with memory wire. Try them on your 14 and 16 gauge wire. You will be pleasantly surprised. All right, so let's try that again. We're going to start with this really, really thick wire, and I'm going to do a wrap loop. So I'm going to come around, and you can really, I hope that you can kind of get the impression of how stiff and thick this wire is, so much so that I'm not even sure how well my feeble hands are going to be able to wrap this around. So I was able to do it because I'm a trained professional, but it was, I wouldn't want to do it again. And then to get this, this tail tucked in, and I want to make sure everybody's noticing when I am doing my cutting, I always put my finger over the part that is going to go flying off, because we don't want it to go flying off. We have furry friends, we have kids, we have spouses. Well, you know, who knows, maybe we want to hit them with a flying projectile of metal, but probably not. So always a good habit just to put your thumb or your forefinger or hold on to whatever it is that you're snipping off, so that it does not hurt anybody. We have had some challenges at shows where people have come to the booth and used our tools, which we always love demonstrating things, but if you don't kind of have that habit of making sure that your tails aren't going to be flying away, it can get a little hairy. Okay, so once again, I have that marked on my pliers so that I know every time my loops will be the same size, which is important if you're doing a wrapped loop link necklace or bracelet or anything where your loops, you want them to be the same. Okay, so that one was the sweet spot, right? That 20 gauge wire is really the sweet spot on many projects. That's definitely my go-to for most things. But again, I mean, there's so many different scenarios where different wires are better, which or more recommended. And see, I put that 26 gauge wire down. Oh, here it is. I need to have like a little, even, I mean, I have so many trays over here in so many special places, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I do. No matter what, I'm going to put something down and immediately lose it. There's no hope. So I'm coming around here and coming around here. Now on the docket for our Michael's community classroom classes are more kind of educational classes about what tools to use in what situations. You can see how soft this artistic wire is, just in me trying to make this loop look nice, not really paying the super best attention. But you can see now between the three of these, the differences in these three wrapped loops. So let's do them by gauge. So we've got 12/14 gauge here. I think this is 14 gauge. So I would be able to do it with 12 gauge, and then 20 gauge in the middle. And then that 26 gauge or 24 gauge, which is very, very thin, still pretty. But you just have to be aware that you couldn't use that on a piece of jewelry that was going to have a huge, gosh, I lost my words for a second, a lot of strain on it. Okay. So those are the first two kind of main things to look for when you're starting your wire work. Now I just want to show really quickly a very simple ear wire with 20 gauge wire, because as I mentioned, artistic wire is not the place really to go to for making ear wires, but making our own ear wires is always a fun thing to do. So this is what I do when I open up my packages of German style wire. It comes with these 2 zip ties. So of course we don't want it all crazy in the package, but I only snip one of these zip ties off. I used to do both of them, but I came to find out, and of course I snipped the wrong one, that keeping one on is a really good idea, because I will show you how I dispense this wire. So you see how it is still keeping nice and tame, for lack of a better word. I can still take the wire out. It's not going all over the place in a crazy mess, but I have access to the wire. And how I distribute this wire is, so this is the one that's out here, is I push this out and then it comes out here. And then you can push it out again and it comes out here. So again, just one of those things that you might not have thought of, but will make your life so much easier. And then if you're like me, the next thing that you do, sometimes without even thinking about it, is grabbing and straightening the end that you have kind of manhandled with your hands with that nylon jaw plier. And usually you will have to snip that blurry end. There we go. Snip that end off because it was caught in the zip tie. So like little tips here and there, which is why being here in class is so wonderful. All right, so 20 gauge wire. Oh, we're going to do an ear wire. So the way that I like to do an ear wire is I like to use the stepped bail making pliers. And these are pliers that are available in Michael's, not the Beadle ones, but they do have them in class, and it's in the store. And it's actually much easier than you might think. There are lots of different tips and tricks and techniques for making ear wires, and most importantly, matching ear wires. And you could certainly be brave and do it with a regular round nose plier, but I like to use a bail making plier because then I know if with the barrels that everything is going to be the same size. Okay, so what I do when I make ear wires is I like to make the small loop first. And to do that, I'm going to wrap on my smallest part of my stepped bail making pliers. And it's not really wrapping because what I'm actually doing is I am small incremental movements making a loop. Is that the best loop I've ever made? No, but that's what happens when you're demonstrating and not looking at what you're doing, but looking at the comments. So then what you do, and usually I come in here between the two largest barrels. And again, I rotate my wrist, not necessarily twisting the wire, but rotating my wrist so that I have a nice shape. And then I come down here, and quick tip about wire, if you're using a flush cutter, you always want the straight edge facing what you're keeping. And see how I'm holding on to this wire here so that it doesn't snip away from me. And then I always think a really nice last step is taking, and I usually use a flat nose pliers for this, and just bend that up. Now, what do we do about this little owie part right here, right? There's always that owie part, no matter what you do, no matter what kind of a clipper that you use, it's always going to be a little burr here on the end. There are a couple of different ways that you can do that. The easiest and most hacky is take an emery board or a nail file and file that off and smooth it around until it doesn't feel owie to the touch anymore. And then that will be smooth. Another thing that you can do is use a jewelry file. And there are plenty of those available in the jewelry making tool section of Michael's. And one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is don't go back and forth like this. Is you want to always go in one direction as you're filing. The third thing is to use something called a cupper, and you can get a cupper that is an attachment for something called a battery operated bead reamer, or you can get a manual cupper, and that will also smooth off that end. But a very important thing to do for sure. And then the one last thing that I wanted to leave everybody with, I always like demonstrating the knotted head pin, because it's just such a perfect way to make your own head pin. And I like using 22 gauge wire. And I also find that, especially when I'm A, demonstrating, and B, just starting out, that artistic wire is a great one to use for this. So again, you can see every time when I pick up my wire, I use those Nylon Jaw Pliers. I think besides my nippers, if somebody asked me what tool I use the most, I think it would be that one. And I'm going to come here. And sorry, gave myself a little knock there. I'm going to come here, and I'm using my round nose pliers, and I'm going to put that in put the wire in the very, very tip of those round nose pliers. So I'm not up here. I'm not up here. I'm in the very tip and the very tip of the wire. So I'm going to, again, I'm rotating my wrist so that I have 3 coils. So that's 2 coils and then 3 coils. Okay. So I'm making a coil, not a spiral. So now what I'm going to do with my thumb is I'm going to push that up so that it is laying against the coil, so that my wire's laying against the coil. And now I'm going to switch hands. Okay, I'm going to take that coil And I'm going to switch it so that the wire is facing to my right, and I'm holding the coil between my thumb and my forefinger, and I'm going to thread the end of that wire through the coil. Okay, and this is where I like to say the magic happens, because what I'm going to do is, once again, with that workhorse, the Nylon Jaw Pliers, I'm going to hold them in my non-dominant hand, and then I'm going to take any flat pliers, it could be a chain nose, a flat nose, whatever, and pull that wire through that coil. Okay, and I usually will do that maybe once, twice, thrice, just to get everything nice and tight and work hardened. And now we have that cute little knot at the end of a head pin waiting for a bead to come on to make a wrapped loop at the top. So just a super, super fun way of not having to buy head pins, and also adding just a little bit of extra something, something to your work. It makes a big difference, especially if maybe you're using a colored wire there, if you're complementing or contrasting with your beads. So, oh my goodness, I think I am going to stop there, because I could probably talk about wire working and gauges of wire and things to make with gauges of wire for at least another hour. But that is why it's so important to sign up for the classes that the Michaels Community Classroom offers, because in each of the classes, for Beadalon, at least me and then Sarah Ellis, who also teaches for Beadalon and artistic wire, we give these tips and these tricks sprinkled all throughout all of our different projects. But I think there's a lot of use in having them all in one place. And I hope that you all agree. We had an amazing crowd in here today, and I cannot thank you enough for hanging out and persevering through all of that information. It was fun. It's always fun for me to have the opportunity to share all of the tips and tricks that I have figured out. And again, disclaimer, the way that I do things might not be the same way that you do things, but if it works for you and you enjoy it and you're not hurting your hands, then that's all. And actually, most importantly, you're having fun. That's what it's all about. So once again, this class will be available within 24 to 48 hours on the Michaels Community Classroom. If you have any questions, or you're doing some cool wire work and you want us to see, post it on your socials and give a little hashtag, make it with Michaels, and then also hashtag Beadalon, because we love to see what you make. And if you are curious about hanging out with me a little bit more, you can always follow me on Instagram. I'm at Meredith Joy Designs, and you'll find out all of the cool new classes and different instructions and materials and things that are coming up for Beadalon and artistic wire by doing that as well. So thanks, Kelly. Kelly was my new moderator today. She did a great job. And thanks as always to Yvette for staying up with all of the comments that were coming through. I was watching everything come, and there were a lot of really good questions, and I very much appreciate her helping out. So that's it for me. Make sure that you check the upcoming classes. We are generally at 2 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesdays. And also on Saturdays at 2 p.m., Sarah Ellis teaches classes for us. And we have a lot of really cool stuff coming up on the docket. So be sure to set all of your reminders and go back and check and join us live or on the replay. So that's it for me today. Thanks again so much for joining me. And until next time, happy beading.